Hermes Agent just did something no fast-moving open-source AI project usually does. It stopped shipping new features for almost 2 weeks and spent that entire time doing one thing: fixing every single priority 1 and priority 2 bug sitting in its repository. And when the dust settled, the number of critical and high-priority issues left open was exactly 0. Not close to 0. Not mostly cleaned up. 0. For a project that has been moving at the kind of speed where 1,000 pull requests can merge in a matter of weeks, that is a genuinely rare moment, and it tells you a lot about what this release is actually about. Version 0.18 is called the Judgment Release, and once you understand why, the name makes a lot of sense. This is not just about Hermes cleaning up its own mess. It is about Hermes learning to judge things properly, judging when a coding task is actually finished instead of just claiming it is done, judging which pieces of advice from different AI models are worth trusting when they disagree with each other, and judging what it has learned about you over time in a way you can actually see instead of just having to trust blindly. In this video, we are breaking down everything that shipped in this update. We're talking about how Mixture of Agents turned into something you can literally select the same way you would pick Claude or GPT as your model, and why being able to see every single model's reasoning before they get blended together into one answer is a bigger deal than it sounds. We're talking about how Hermes now actually verifies that your code works instead of taking its own word for it. We are getting into the new memory timeline that lets you watch, edit, and even delete what your agent has learned about you. And we are covering the infrastructure changes that make self-hosting Hermes feel a lot more like running real production software. Before we get into all of that, if you're new here, this channel covers AI agents, open source tools, and self-hosted infrastructure on a near weekly basis. So if that is your kind of thing, subscribing means you will not miss the next breakdown. And if this video ends up being useful to you, a like genuinely helps it reach more people who are trying to figure out whether this update is worth their time. And sharing it with anyone on your team who is running Hermes is probably the fastest way to save them from digging through nearly 2,000 closed issues themselves. With all of that said, let's get into what actually changed. To understand why closing every single priority 1 and priority 2 issue matters, it helps to know what those labels actually mean inside the Hermes Agent project. A priority 0 issue is something critical, the kind of bug that breaks core functionality or puts user data at risk. A priority 1 issue is right behind it. High-impact problems that make the tool noticeably worse to use even if they are not catastrophic. In most fast-moving open-source projects, especially ones built by an agent framework that ships updates every few weeks, these issues pile up faster than they get resolved. New features keep getting prioritized because they are what gets attention, while bug fixes quietly stack up in the background. Hermes Agent did the opposite this cycle. For roughly 12 days, the team shifted almost all of its effort away from new feature work and pointed it directly at the backlog. The numbers make the scale of that effort pretty clear. 3 priority 0 issues closed, alongside 8 priority 0 pull requests merged. Then the much bigger number, 493 priority 1 issues closed, with 188 priority 1 pull requests merged to fix them. Add that up, and you get roughly 692 of the highest priority items in the entire repository resolved in under 2 weeks. And that was happening alongside a much larger cleanup, with close to 1,900 issues and pull requests closed across the whole project in that same window. What makes this more than just an impressive statistic is what it represents. 0 open priority 0 issues and 0 open priority 1 issues means that, at least at the moment of this release, there is not a single known critical or high-impact bug sitting unresolved in Hermes Agent. That is not something you see often in a project moving at this speed, and the team was direct about wanting to keep it that way going forward, treating a clean priority 0 and priority 1 backlog as the new baseline rather than a one-time event. There's also a smaller, more human detail buried in this story. Right before the release was due to go out, the team found and fixed a genuinely nasty edge case bug involving interrupt protected compression and sibling forks, the kind of low-level concurrency issue that tends to surface at the worst possible time. It got resolved in an all-nighter push just ahead of the cut, which is a good reminder that behind a release note listing clean statistics, there is usually a team of people scrambling to make sure the numbers actually hold up. Community contributor critique for poor deserves a specific mention here, having carried a significant share of this cleanup work personally, including reliability fixes to Hermes cron's scheduling system and hardening against credential exposure, on top of that late compression fork fix. When a release note singles out one contributor by name for carrying this much of the load, it is usually a sign of exactly how much work went into getting that number down to 0. The bigger picture here is what this signals about where Hermes Agent wants to position itself. Shipping flashy new features is what gets a project attention on social feeds and in comparison videos. Spending nearly 2 weeks doing nothing but fixing bugs does not generate the same kind of excitement. But it is exactly the kind of decision a team makes when they're trying to be taken seriously as production infrastructure rather than just another fast-moving open-source experiment. With that foundation actually cleaned up, it makes a lot more sense why the rest of this release leans so heavily into trust, verification, and transparency as its core themes. Mixture of agents has existed in Hermes Agent for a while now, but up until this release, it worked more like a special mode you had to consciously switch into. You would toggle it on, Hermes would quietly route your prompt through several different models behind the scenes, and you would get back one blended answer without much visibility into how that answer was actually formed. It worked, but it lived a bit separately from the rest of how you interact with Hermes day to day. Version 0.18 changes that in a pretty fundamental way. Mixture of agents ensembles are now treated as first-class models in their own right. That means you can create a named ensemble, give it a label like your own personal council of models, and it will show up in the exact same model picker you would use to select Claude or GPT or Grok or any other single model you have configured. There is no separate toggle to remember anymore. You just pick your ensemble the way you would pick any other model, and Hermes handles the routing underneath it. The more interesting change is what happens once you have made that selection. Every single reference model inside the ensemble now has its own labeled reasoning block that renders before the final aggregated answer shows up. If your ensemble includes 3 or 4 different models, you can actually read through what each one of them concluded individually in its own clearly marked section before you ever see the combined response. This might sound like a small interface change, but it fundamentally shifts what Mixture of Agents feels like to use. Instead of trusting a black box that blends several opinions into one answer without showing its work, you get to see exactly where those models agreed, where they disagreed, and how much the final aggregated response actually leaned on any one of them. On top of that, the aggregator's final answer now streams live as it is being generated, rather than making you sit through a long silence while multiple models process in the background before anything appears on screen. That silence used to be one of the more frustrating parts of using Mixture of Agents, since you had no real feedback that anything was happening until the complete answer suddenly showed up. Now you get the same kind of live streaming experience you would expect from a single model, even though there are several models working behind that one ensemble. For anyone who just wants a quick one-time comparison without permanently switching their default model, there's also a new /moa command. It runs a single prompt through your default ensemble preset and then automatically restores whatever model you were using beforehand, which makes it easy to spot check a difficult question against multiple models without disrupting your normal workflow. Taken together, this turns Mixture of Agents from a somewhat opaque power user feature into something genuinely useful for everyday decision-making. If you have ever found yourself asking the same question to 2 or 3 different chat interfaces just to compare their answers, Hermes is now doing that comparison for you automatically, and for the first time actually showing you the disagreement instead of hiding it behind a single merge response. Anyone who has spent real time working with agentic coding tools has run into this exact problem before. You ask an agent to implement something, it works through the task, and then it confidently tells you the work is complete. Except when you actually go check, something is broken, a test is failing, or the feature does not quite do what you asked for in the first place. The agent was not necessarily lying to you on purpose. It genuinely believed the task was finished because it never actually verified its own output against anything real. It just generated code, looked at what it generated, and decided that looked correct enough to call it done. This release takes direct aim at that problem, and it does so in a way that feels less like a small patch and more like a change to how Hermes fundamentally thinks about completing work. Hermes now records what the team is calling verification evidence for coding tasks. Instead of Hermes simply reporting that something is finished based on its own read of the code it just wrote, it actually runs your project's real checks, whether that means your test suite, your linter, your build process, or whatever validation steps your project already relies on. Completion is now decided based on that evidence, not based on the model's own confidence in its output. This extends directly into how the /goal command works. Goals in Hermes now support what are called completion contracts, which means you define up front exactly what finished actually looks like for a given task before Hermes starts working on it. Rather than leaving the definition of success open to interpretation, you're giving Hermes a concrete target to judge itself against, and the standing goal loop checks its own progress against that evidence as it works rather than just deciding on its own that it has done enough. For situations where the built-in checks are not quite enough, there's also a new pre-verify hook that lets you wire in your own custom validation logic. If your project has specific requirements that a generic test suite would not catch, you can plug that logic directly into the verification process, so Hermes checks against the standards that actually matter for your codebase. There is also a smaller but genuinely useful addition here, a new /goal wait command that takes a process ID as an argument. This lets you park a standing goal so that it waits on a specific background process to finish before continuing, which is a practical fix for situations where a goal depends on something else running in parallel that needs to complete first. It is worth mentioning that verify on stop, the setting that determines whether Hermes automatically verifies work when a task appears to be finished, ships with a default of off, along with a one-time migration for anyone upgrading from previous version. It is also smart enough to skip documentation-only edits, since running a full verification pass on a markdown file does not make much sense. This kind of surface awareness is a small detail, but it shows the feature was built with real workflows in mind rather than just applied as a blanket rule across every possible change. If you have spent any real time working with Claude Code, OpenCode, or Codex, this entire section probably sounds familiar because agents claiming false completion is one of the most consistent frustrations across every major tool in this space right now. Hermes is not claiming to have solved this problem completely, but building actual verification evidence directly into how goals and tasks are judged is a meaningfully different approach than just hoping the model gets better at self-assessment on its own. One of the things that has always made Hermes Agent stand out from a typical coding assistant is that it is designed to remember things about how you work and build up its own skill library over time. This release pushes that idea further in two directions at once, making it easier for Hermes to learn new things automatically and making it far easier for you to actually see what it has learned. The first piece is a new /learn command, and it works exactly as broadly as it sounds. You point Hermes at basically anything, a directory full of code, a URL, or even just a workflow you walked through together in a previous conversation, and it distills that into a reusable skill on its own. It follows the same skill standards your project already defines in its contributing documentation, so the skills it generates automatically fit the same structure and conventions as the skills you or your team might write by hand. Instead of manually writing out a new skill file every time you notice a repeatable pattern in your work, you can now just tell Hermes to learn it directly. The second piece addresses something that has quietly been a weak point in agent frameworks with persistent memory for a while now, which is visibility. It is one thing for an agent to say it remembers things about you and has built up a library of skills over time. It is a completely different thing to actually see what those memories and skills are in a format that makes sense. That is exactly what the new /journey view solves. It is a timeline available in both the command line and the terminal interface that lays out everything Hermes has learned over time, memories and skills together in chronological order. And critically, it is not just a read-only log. You can edit or delete any individual memory or skill directly from that view, which means if Hermes learned something incorrect or picked up an outdated pattern from an old project, you can correct it immediately instead of it lingering in the background indefinitely. The desktop app takes this even further with something called the memory graph, a playable, radial, top-down visualization of everything Hermes knows about you and your work. Rather than scrolling through a flat timeline, you get a visual map you can explore, watching how memories and skills connect and build on each other over time. Between the journey view and the memory graph, this is genuinely the first time Hermes has given users a real window into what used to be a black box. You always knew the agent was remembering things. Now you can actually watch it happen and prune it when something is wrong. There's also a quieter but meaningful change happening underneath all of this. The background process that reviews conversations to decide what is worth saving as a new memory or skill has been reworked to be significantly cheaper to run. It now routes to a smaller auxiliary model rather than using your primary model for every review pass. It works from a digested summary of context instead of replaying entire conversations from scratch. And it adapts how often it runs rather than checking on a fixed schedule regardless of how active you have been. The release notes describe this as running at a fraction of the previous cost, which matters a lot if you're running Hermes continuously and paying per token for whichever model provider you have connected. Put together, these two features solve two different halves of the same underlying problem. Learn makes it easier for Hermes to build up useful knowledge about how you work without you having to manually write it all down. Journey and the memory graph make sure that knowledge never turns into something you just have to trust blindly, because now you can actually look at it, understand it, and fix it whenever something is not quite right. Delegating work to sub-agents is not a new idea in Hermes Agent, but the way that delegation worked before this release had a real limitation. When you asked Hermes to hand off a task using Delegate Task, you were generally stuck waiting for that sub-agent to finish before your chat felt fully usable again, especially if you were delegating more than one thing at a time. This release removes that limitation entirely. Delegate Task can now fan out multiple sub-agents that all run fully in the background at the same time. That means your main chat is never blocked while those sub-agents are working. You can keep talking to Hermes, ask it something completely unrelated, or just step away entirely, and the sub-agents will keep running independently in the background regardless of what you do in your active conversation. The practical value of this becomes obvious once you think about the kind of work that benefits from parallelization. Say you wanted Hermes to research 5 different competitors for a project you were working on. Under the old model, you would either be doing that sequentially, waiting for one to finish before starting the next, or you would be juggling the fact that your main conversation was tied up while a single delegation was in progress. Now you can fire off all 5 as background sub-agents in one go, and they work through their research simultaneously while you continue doing something else entirely. The same logic applies to something like auditing multiple modules in a code base, where each module can be checked independently without needing to wait its turn. Once every sub-agent in that fan-out finishes its work, Hermes consolidates all of the results into a single turn for you to review, rather than making you track down and piece together several separate outputs on your own. You get one clean summary that reflects everything that happened across all of the parallel work, instead of having to manually reconcile a handful of scattered responses. To keep this from feeling opaque while it is happening, the command line and terminal interface status bar now tracks background sub-agents directly, so you always have visibility into what is currently running, even while your main conversation continues on uninterrupted. This is a fairly small addition on paper, but it fits neatly into the same theme running through this entire release, doing more work without asking you to sacrifice visibility into what that work actually is. If most of what we have covered so far has been about how Hermes thinks and remembers, this section is about where a lot of that thinking actually happens day to day, the desktop app, which received one of the biggest overhauls of this entire release. The centerpiece of that overhaul is a new project system. Instead of treating every code base you work in as a loose, undifferentiated space, the desktop app now organizes everything around a clear structure: project, repo, and lane. You get a dedicated sidebar for browsing between your different code bases, a coding rail built specifically for navigating and working within a project, a review pane for looking over changes, and proper Git worktree management built directly into the interface. If you regularly bounce between multiple code bases or multiple branches within the same project, this is the kind of structural change that removes a lot of friction you probably did not realize you were dealing with until it was gone. Alongside projects, the desktop app now includes a multi-terminal panel, letting you run several terminal sessions side by side within the same window. These terminals are read only from the agent's perspective, meaning Hermes can observe what is happening in them without taking control away from you. And terminal tabs, along with their scrollback history, now persist across relaunches of the app, so you're not starting from a blank slate every time you reopen Hermes. On the review side, file diffs now render in a pull request style format directly inside the chat interface, which makes reviewing what an agent actually changed feel a lot closer to reviewing a real pull request on GitHub rather than scrolling through raw text output. There is also a new in-app spot editor for quickly previewing files without needing to jump into a separate application, and Assistant Markdown responses now support inline rich embeds, meaning diagrams and alerts can render directly inside a conversation rather than being described in plain text. A handful of smaller quality of life changes round out this section. There is a new conversation timeline rail that helps you navigate long-running threads without endless scrolling, a context usage breakdown popover that shows you exactly how your context window is being spent, a read-only spectator view that lets you watch a sub-agent working without interrupting it, and a draggable floating composer for writing messages wherever is most convenient on your screen. Auto text to speech can now be toggled directly, and backups can be imported and exported straight from the web interface. And then there is a genuinely lighthearted addition worth mentioning on its own, an entirely optional roaming pet that lives inside the desktop app. It has no functional purpose whatsoever. It is just a small mascot you can opt into having wander around your interface. And honestly, after a section about verification contracts and background sub-agent orchestration, it is a nice reminder that the people building this are still having some fun with it. Taken as a whole, this desktop overhaul is less about any single headline feature and more about Hermes closing the gap between feeling like a chat interface with some coding features bolted on and feeling like an actual development environment built around working with an agent as a real part of your process. For anyone running Hermes Agent on their own server rather than just using it locally on a single machine, this section is probably the most immediately practical part of the entire release, even if it does not come with flashy visuals attached to it. The first major addition here is scale to zero support, paired with what the team calls drain coordination. In plain terms, this means the Hermes gateway can now go fully dormant when nobody is using it, rather than sitting there consuming resources around the clock regardless of activity. For anyone hosting Hermes on a VPS or a shared team server, that translates directly into lower costs, since you're no longer paying to keep a gateway running idle overnight or across long stretches when nobody on your team is actively using it. When someone does send a request, the gateway wakes back up on demand. So this is not a trade-off where you lose availability in exchange for savings. Drain coordination is what makes this whole system safe to actually use in a real environment. Before this release, restarting a gateway, migrating it to different infrastructure, or applying an automatic update carried a real risk of cutting off anyone who happened to be mid-conversation at that exact moment. Drain coordination fixes that by making sure the gateway quiesces cleanly, finishing up any in-flight conversations before it actually shuts down or migrates, rather than abruptly dropping connections the instant a disruptive lifecycle event kicks in. Combined with scale to zero, this is what actually makes hosted and relay-based Hermes deployments feel like production-grade infrastructure rather than something you have to babysit manually. If you have been running Hermes on something like a hosting or VPS as part of a self-hosted setup, this is exactly the kind of change that makes that setup meaningfully more reliable without requiring you to change anything about how you configured it. The second addition in this section is a new first-class provider, Google Vertex AI, giving you direct access to Gemini models through Vertex's OpenAI-compatible endpoint. This solves a problem that anyone who has tried to connect Vertex to a custom provider setup before has almost certainly run into. Unlike most model providers, Vertex does not use a simple static API key. Instead, every single request needs a short-lived OAuth 2 token, generated from either service account JSON file or application default credentials, and that token typically expires in about an hour. Previously, trying to wire Vertex into Hermes through a generic custom provider configuration meant that things would work fine for a while and then quietly break mid-session once that token expired, which is exactly the kind of failure that is confusing to debug if you do not already know what is happening under the hood. With this release, Hermes handles all of that automatically. It mints these short-lived tokens on its own and refreshes them behind the scenes before they expire. So from your perspective, Vertex just works the same way any other provider does, without you needing to think about token lifetimes at all. Neither of these two changes are the kind of thing that shows up well in a screen recording, but if you're someone actually running Hermes in a self-hosted or team environment rather than just experimenting with it locally, this is arguably one of the more consequential parts of the entire release. Every release cycle for a project handling API credentials, browser automation, and messaging platform integrations is going to include some amount of security work, but this release leans into it more heavily than usual, which fits naturally alongside the backlog clean sweep covered earlier. Rather than walking through every single fix, since there were quite a few, it is worth focusing on the handful that matter most if you are actually running Hermes with real credentials connected to real services. The first is a lockdown of the attack surface around how MCP configuration gets persisted. Since MCP servers often carry meaningful permissions and access to external tools, tightening how that configuration is stored and handled closes off a category of risk that becomes more relevant the more MCP servers you have connected to your setup. The second addresses something genuinely concerning if you had run into it, a fix for cron jobs that were allowing base URL overrides in a way that could potentially exfiltrate provider credentials. Cron jobs in Hermes run unattended on a schedule, which means a vulnerability like this could have been quietly leaking sensitive credentials in the background without anyone noticing until it was too late. This is now blocked. The third is a browser cloud metadata floor that now gets enforced across every backend, not just some of them. If you are unfamiliar with why this matters, cloud metadata endpoints are internal services that cloud providers expose to virtual machines, and they can contain sensitive information like temporary credentials if an attacker manages to trick a browser automation tool into requesting them. Enforcing this floor consistently across every backend closes a gap that previously only existed on some configurations and not others. The fourth is a fix to how /resume and /sessions were scoped, closing what is known as an insecure direct object reference, or IDOR, vulnerability. In practical terms, this means sessions are now properly scoped to the caller who actually owns them, preventing a scenario where one user might have been able to access or resume a session that did not belong to them. None of these fixes are the kind of thing that generates excitement in a release announcement, and that is exactly the point. Security work like this rarely gets attention when it goes right, only when it goes wrong. Bundling this many meaningful fixes into a single release, on top of the Priority 0 and Priority 1 backlog sweep from earlier in this video, reinforces the same underlying theme running through this entire update. This is a release built around trust, whether that trust is about an agent verifying its own work, showing you what it remembers, or simply making sure your credentials stay where they belong. Beyond the headline features, this release includes a long list of smaller additions that are each worth knowing about, even if none of them individually deserve a full section on their own. Starting with a few workflow improvements, there is a new /prompt command that opens your default editor whenever you want to compose a longer, multi-line prompt, which is a small but genuinely useful addition if you have ever tried typing out a detailed multi-paragraph request directly into a chat input and found it awkward to edit. There is also a /reasoning full option, which gives you an uncapped view of a model's thinking rather than the trimmed down version you normally see. And for anyone who wants to start from as close to a blank canvas as possible, there is a new blank slate setup mode that gives you a minimal agent with almost nothing enabled by default, letting you opt into every feature manually rather than starting with everything turned on. On the messaging side, several platforms picked up meaningful upgrades this cycle. WhatsApp now supports native media delivery. Teams gain native video, voice, and document sending. Discord now renders an agent's reasoning as subtext rather than mixing it directly into the main response. And Signal picked up support for AAC voice notes. On top of these individual upgrades, the full set of messaging platform adapters, covering Slack, DingTalk, WhatsApp, Matrix, Faceshoe, Telegram, WeCom, email, and SMS have all been migrated to being bundled by default, meaning you no longer need to manually enable them one by one to get access. There were also a handful of performance improvements worth a quick mention, including lazy loading for gateway platform adapters, so you're not loading integrations you're not actually using, a faster configuration parsing library, improvements to how full text search segments get merged together, and general speed improvements to commands like list profiles. Finally, it is worth calling out a few notable reverts from this cycle, because they say something honest about how this team operates. Cron job storage was reverted back to a per profile model after the new approach caused issues. The automatic cloning of the auth.json file was removed after it started causing unexpected sibling revocation problems with OAuth sessions. A set of Windows terminal pop-up changes got rolled back entirely, and the prompt caching enable toggle was pulled out for further reevaluation before shipping again. None of these reverts are exciting on their own, but they matter for the same reason the backlog clean sweep mattered earlier in this video. A team that is willing to publicly walk back a change that was not working rather than quietly leaving it broken or pretending it was fine is a team that is optimizing for the tool actually working well over time, rather than optimizing for how impressive a changelog looks on release day. Stepping back from the individual features, the through line of this entire release becomes pretty clear once you look at everything together. 0 open Priority 0 and Priority 1 bugs. Verification evidence that decides whether a task is actually done instead of just trusting the model's own report. Mixture of agents finally showing you what each individual model actually thinks instead of hiding the behind one blended answer. A memory system you can watch grow, explore visually, and correct whenever something is wrong. None of these features exist in isolation. Every single one of them is answering some version of the same underlying question. How do you actually trust an agent that is doing more and more work on your behalf without you watching every step? That is a meaningfully different focus than most of what we have covered from this project in the past. Earlier releases like the Everywhere release or the Tenacity release were largely about expansion, more providers, more messaging platforms, more raw capability packed into the tool. The Curator release before this one introduced autonomous self-improvement, letting Hermes manage its own skill library without you having to intervene. Version 0.18 is doing something different. It is taking a step back and asking whether all of that expanding capability can actually be trusted, and then building the tooling to make that trust something you can verify for yourself rather than something you just have to take on faith. Whether that shift matters to you personally probably depends on how you have been using Hermes so far. If you have mostly been experimenting with it, trying out new providers and messaging integrations as they show up, this release might feel a little quieter than past ones, since there is no single flashy new capability dominating the changelog. But if you have been running Hermes as something closer to real infrastructure, delegating actual coding work to it, relying on its memory system to carry context across sessions, or hosting it yourself for a team, this is very likely the most consequential release the project has shipped so far, precisely because it is focused on making sure everything Hermes already does can actually be trusted at scale. If you take one thing away from this entire breakdown, let it be these 3 points. Mixture of agents is no longer a black box. You can now actually see what every individual model in your ensemble is thinking before they get combined into one answer. Verification is now built directly into how Hermes decides a task is finished, meaning it is checking real evidence instead of just trusting its own confidence. And the memory system finally gives you a real window into what your agent has learned, with the journey timeline and the memory graph letting you watch it grow and fix it whenever something is wrong. Underneath all of that, the bigger story of this release is a project that just spent nearly 2 weeks doing nothing but closing bugs until it hit 0 open priority 0 and priority 1 issues, and then built an entire update around the theme of trust. That is not the kind of release that always gets the most attention, but it is very often the kind that matters the most once you are actually relying on a tool day to day. Let me know in the comments which feature from this update you're most interested in trying out yourself, whether that is the new mixture of agents model picker, the verification-driven goals, or the memory graph in the desktop app. If this breakdown helped you get a handle on everything that shipped in version 0.18, a like genuinely helps this video reach more people trying to figure out whether this update is worth their time, and subscribing means you will not miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.